Hi, I'm Lauren Henke, and I'm joined by my co-host, Stephen Chun, for another episode of the NRG Oncology Podcast. Today, we've gone outside of NRG Oncology to get a broader perspective on some of the seismic shifts we are seeing in health policy and clinical trials. Our guest today is Dr. Clifford Hudis, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO as we know it. Dr. Hudis built his career as a medical oncologist, leading breast cancer medical oncology at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center before becoming CEO of ASCO in 2016. With ASCO, Dr. Hudis has played a key role in major initiatives in just about every other aspect of the organization.
Dr. Hudis, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to just say how thrilled we are to have someone with your level of expertise on the podcast. To start off, I know this is really basic, but for those of us out there who are unfamiliar with the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, what exactly is ASCO, and what, if any, interest does ASCO have in the success of National Cancer Institute-sponsored cooperative groups like NRG Oncology?
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you and for the chance to talk about these topics. In fact, the history of ASCO and its purpose is inextricably intertwined with that of the National Cancer Institute. So a very brief recap of history is that ASCO was founded in 1964 as the first really effective systemic therapeutics were being developed. It was that decade, of course, when we began to see complete remissions in leukemia and in lymphoma, especially Hodgkin disease. And the National Cancer Act, signed by Richard Nixon as president in 1971, established the modern National Cancer Institute. And ASCO, at the same time, led the American Board of Internal Medicine in establishing medical oncology as a subspecialty in 1972. And so just if we hit pause for a moment, those early first few years of the 1970s were a really heady time when, on the one hand, the nation was committing to accelerated and rapid progress against cancer, and oncology, at least medical oncology, as a defined medical subspecialty was really being launched. So from that moment till now, ASCO, which is a multidisciplinary society with more than 50,000 members in over 170 countries, has had a deep commitment to the success in general of medical research. And by medical research here, I mean multidisciplinary, multimodality research for cancer. And that, of course, in many cases starts with the NCI. We are committed to progress that makes patients' lives better, and we are reliant, I think, on lots and lots of innovation and opportunities that in many cases are only created through publicly funded research enterprises like the NCI.
As someone who has built their career primarily through avenues outside of NRG Oncology, we'd really like to hear your perspective on what seems like major changes in our country's approach to not just oncology, but academic medicine in general. One of the biggest hot button issues we've, I think, all been hearing about lately are the proposed reductions in the indirect costs of federal grants for medical research. What are direct and indirect costs in federal cancer grants as it pertains to cooperative groups like NRG Oncology? And what does ASCO do to advocate for groups like NRG Oncology?
I built my career within the cooperative groups. I was an investigator in the Cancer and Leukemia Group B, which is one of the original cooperative groups. In fact, a good bit of my good fortune in medical oncology was because my mentor introduced me to the cooperative groups and pushed me out of the four walls of Memorial Sloan Kettering to network with experts, in my case, in breast cancer, but indeed in other areas as well, through the Cancer and Leukemia Group B. It's in the Cancer and Leukemia Group B that I became very close to Richard Shilsky, who later went on to serve as ASCO's first chief medical officer. And it was through this CLGB that I also became very close to Monica Bertagnoli, who replaced Rich as the chair of the CLGB, and later served as the president of ASCO and later still as the most recent NIH director. And I point out to you in the context of today's discussion that she was NCI director before she was the NIH director. So I owe a great deal of whatever success I've enjoyed in my career because of the cooperative groups. I wrote the breast cancer section of the cooperative group grant renewal. And with Dr. Eric Weiner, I actually for about a decade was co-chair of the breast committee of CLGB. However, it is true that since I took my job at ASCO in 2016, I've been much more of an outsider. And indeed, I think the cooperative groups are vital to the American research effort. The question you just asked was very specific about the indirect rates. And I think in order for the average person to understand this, we just have to back up a half step. When an investigator writes a grant proposal, it includes a budget for what are generally called direct expenses, and that would be the materials to conduct research, the supplies, the collaborators, all of the things that are going to be utilized in running the research project. However, there are lots of other things that are necessary for an investigator to run a clinical trial or a laboratory trial. They have to work in an office building someplace. They need administrative support. They need all the other services that anybody else would need in that environment. And we call those facilities and administration fees, and we shorthand that as indirect. And a very simple way to understand this is that an investigator writes a grant, I'm going to make it up for $100,000 per year. And then we, on top of that, get an indirect rate, which accounts for some of these unlisted expenses that are absolutely necessary for the research to proceed. And that's called, again, the indirect rate. And if that's 15%, then that's 15% of the grant. And if the grant was 100,000, then the total spend becomes 115,000. In the context of today's challenges, of course, one thing to keep in mind is that in a general way, the NIH, when it sets these indirect rates, does it on an institutional by institutional or entity by entity basis. It does it on a regular time schedule, and it's negotiated between the parties to account for the different circumstances of different research enterprises. So at a high level, that's the fundamental structure. We at ASCO advocate fiercely for adequate support for all the components of the research environment, and we do that through our advocacy on the Hill at the federal level on behalf of the NIH and the NCI in particular, but among others.
Anytime that there are changes in policy, there's always the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think it's natural for us as humans with these, for example, indirect cost cuts that are being proposed to focus on the bad and the ugly at first. First, what are the potential upsides of some of the policy changes before we get into the downsides? And what do you think the potential good is from the policy changes at the federal level? For example, while they are proposing to cut indirect costs, might there be opportunities to reallocate these funds, which have already been appropriated, to the direct costs? As I understand it, indirect costs could be reduced and there could be better efficiencies in research, or at least that's what the thinking is. Tell us, what do you think is the good, the bad, and the ugly here?
Well, I'm going to start with the bad. On the bad side, and I alluded to this a moment ago, under existing law and regulation, the indirect rate is supposed to be responsive to the needs and conditions at each one of the receiving organizations, and they're supposed to be negotiated. So a blanket, uniform, single indirect rate is, on the face of it, seemingly not consistent with that law. And cutting an indirect rate that could have been anywhere from 30 to 75% down to 15% in very short order will have a profound disruptive effect on any organization which was planning, like all of us do, on a steady, consistent basis for revenue versus expenses. And so this would be a pretty big shock to any system. I will mention that in terms of advocacy, we provided an affidavit testing to the potential harm that that sudden change would make. And that was at least part of the consideration in the second temporary restraining order that was later converted, I don't know if that's the right legal word, into a preliminary injunction about now 2 weeks ago. But ultimately, this issue is going to be about who gets to set the rate, and then after that, what it should be. So I think the hard part of this, or the bad part, is the sudden shock to a system that, of course, like any enterprise, was counting on a certain revenue. I think you highlight something that is fair to point out and important, and that is that you're not going to find anybody who says we should make slower progress against cancer or other diseases. What they are arguing for is more efficiency. In fact, many people believe that with greater efficiency, there could be more rapid progress. That may or may not be true, but I will say that there's never been a country like the United States that's invested so consistently and so broadly in science and technology, and especially health-related science and oncology. And that has generated for us both advances that we were targeting, but also lots of serendipity and advances that we maybe didn't see coming. And I think that we have to be very thoughtful about making changes in a system that has been so rewarding. I mean, overall cancer mortality has fallen significantly over the last few decades. Again, some might argue that it could have fallen even faster if we were more efficient. But I think that we should take pride in the progress that we've made. We should be looking for ways to make faster progress. And I'm not sure that trimming to the bone and focusing solely on efficiency is actually the best route to meaningful progress against cancer. So right now there are about 18 million cancer survivors alive, and that there were just 3 million in 1971 when that National Cancer Act was signed. We have a decline in mortality of about 29, let's call it 30% since 1971. We're setting a pretty high bar if we think efficiency is going to actually increase or accelerate that rate of progress.
One thing I'd like to ask you about, which we've been doing a lot of soul searching about lately, is the value of NRG Oncology to the American taxpayer. As we previously discussed with Dr. Norman Woolmark, one of the group chairs and the principal investigator of NRG, the NSABP, one of the key components of NRG, was responsible for the revolution in breast cancer surgery that showed we don't have to subject every woman with breast cancer to a radical mastectomy. Similarly, the RTOG played a fundamental role establishing that many lung cancers could be cured with radiation for patients too sick to undergo surgery. And for instance, the Gynecologic Oncology Group showed that you don't have to do a radical hysterectomy on every woman who has a cervical cancer. And really, none of this work would have been funded by a pharmaceutical or a device company. As an objective outsider to NRG Oncology, perhaps, what do you see as the value of federally funded cooperative oncology groups like NRG Oncology to the American taxpayer?
Well, first of all, I think in basketball terms, that's like a layup or something, because the return on investment, and I don't mean return on the dollars invested, but the impact on life that the cooperative groups, and specifically in the example you gave, NRG, has contributed over the decades is immeasurable. And there have been financial studies and others that have looked at not just the job and economic benefits of investing in research and cooperative groups, but specifically the remarkable return on investment per dollar in terms of improved quality and length of life for Americans because of cooperative groups. So that's a lot of words. I want to say something much more succinctly, which you enumerated, but you left it for me to say. The key thing that the cooperative groups do, and they do it with chemotherapy or systemic therapy drug trials also, is they often do the trials that pharma or industry or investors in general won't do. And the reason for that is that they are not going to yield a clear profit for investors. So for example, comparing 3 kinds of active, let's say, brand name drugs for a disease is a great example of the kind of thing that the cooperative group will do, and that in most cases a pharmaceutical company would not do. Because while they might compare their new product to an older standard that they believe they can arguably surpass and get registration and approval, usage, and sales, they would be less likely to do a comparison to their competitor's drug. And we in the cooperative groups, you and NRG, do exactly that kind of trial every day. And without the cooperative groups doing those trials, I am very, very concerned that those will be the kinds of questions that simply never get answered, and we will be extrapolating from unrelated clinical trials, trying to discern whether choice A or B is better for a given patient. I can give you a concrete example just to bring this home. You listed, of course, reduction in invasive surgery and the like. But in the cooperative groups, when I was there, we were able to compare generic taxane against a new branded version of it that was formulated differently and touted as markedly superior. And in that 3-arm trial, we were able to show, of course, in the end that there was no meaningful difference at all. And that's a study that just wouldn't be done by anybody else.
So we've kind of touched on this earlier, but one of the biggest things I've taken away from the public discourse recently is the desire to lower the costs of doing medical research. Clinical trials are substantially more expensive to conduct in the United States than in many other countries. Yet, in spite of this cost, it can often take 1 to 2 years, maybe even longer, to get a clinical trial open in the United States than it would be elsewhere in the world. How has the cost and complexity of doing clinical trials changed throughout your career? And how are you and ASCO working to address the challenges of cost and regulatory burden in clinical trials?
So thank you for that question, because in this case, we are not just running think tanks and writing papers and making prescriptions for how the world should act. We actually have a demonstration project of our own that proves the feasibility of this. So to your first point about the cost and complexity, you're absolutely right. And we've all watched it. When I began my career in medical oncology in the very early 90s, I was able, with my mentor, to write a clinical research trial. It was probably around then 20 to 30 pages. It could be relatively quickly approved as an investigator-initiated study. It could go through the local IRB, and I was able to run a series of trials like that. In fact, that's how we piloted what became known as dose-dense chemotherapy in the end of the 1980s into the 1990s. And by the way, my mentors would talk about the fact that in the 1960s, 70s, and even into the 80s, that they could write a clinical trial in 6 or 8 pages and, achieve the same thing. And many of the foundational studies that established the standard treatment for Hodgkin disease and testes cancer and the like were of that ilk. Fast forward to the modern era, the complexity of regulations and the high stakes, to be fair, of drug approval at the FDA. And, every T is crossed, every I is dotted, which is fine. Safety is paramount always, but the way in which we assure that has become definitely a significant and challenging burden for all. So we at ASCO have partnered with other interested stakeholders, for example, including the FDA, Friends of Cancer Research, and others. And we've held those think tanks, talked honestly about what a responsible clinical trial design really has to look like, about what really needs to be included. And not only have we published all that, but when it came time for us, now about 10 years ago, to launch our first ASCO-developed clinical trial, which is TAPER, a registry for the use of targeted therapies that are approved but given off-label, we put all of this into practice. And so our eligibility criteria are simple and straightforward. Our follow-up on the trial is relatively simple. The expense of conducting the trial is much more modest. And in fact, technically, we are the CRO, the research organization for this clinical trial. We don't have an outside contracted CRO, and our data is clean enough and high quality and accepted by all. And it's proof that you can run a much more lean, efficient clinical trial. And we do it at over 260 sites. We have somewhere over 3,000 patients registered. I mean, I think it's actually maybe 4,000 at this point registered, over 3,000 treated. So we've not just talked the talk, but walked the walk. The challenge, I'll close with this, that is really difficult is no matter how much we talk about it, in the end, it's up to both regulators who say they endorse this and industry to accept this and simplify the process that we're currently involved in.
I think that's a really great example. I want to shift topics to another way in which ASCO and NRG Oncology often intersect. I don't have the exact numbers, but many NRG oncology trials end up presented at the ASCO annual meeting and are ultimately published in ASCO's flagship journal, the Journal of Clinical Oncology, or JCO. This year, the impact factor of JCO remained above 50. For NRG oncology investigators out there who aspire to publish their trials in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, could you take us through ASCO's vision for JCO and what is the selection process like for the editorial board?
Okay, a couple of things. Number one, when ASCO was founded in 1964, among the initial intentions was to hold a meeting, to establish a place for networking, and to serve as a conduit for up-to-date medical information. That is to say, to distribute knowledge. And the way, of course, that you did that in the 1960s was to publish. So we actually set out to publish a journal from the very first days. That's the birth of the Journal of Clinical Oncology. However, it's important to point something out that people don't always appreciate. There is a firewall between what goes into the JCO and what we do at ASCO. What I mean is we hire an editor-in-chief. That person has a contract, and that person has editorial control over what is selected for the journal. There are associate editors who work with that editor-in-chief. And now, as you know, we have an expanded family of JCOs, plural, for various sub-areas of oncology. But here, again, it's just critically important that everybody understand that ASCO itself exerts no editorial control over what goes into the JCO. That all said, the priority of the JCO is to publish practice-changing research of the highest impact and to include with that meaningful expert commentary and controversy that puts research into context and that allows people to debate and really figure out or fine-tune the most appropriate application of research. We also have worked over the years to accelerate the peer review process, to make it easier for people to submit without having to do too much formatting, and also to cascade the journals. So if we think, for example, an article is really good and important, but not high enough priority for the JCO, it can be automatically cascaded down to one of the linked or sister journals, if you will. In the end, I will say, though, there's so much high quality work. I think publication in the JCO is about as competitive as it's ever been. And with a slightly broken heart and feeling a little sheepish, lots of really good content, unfortunately, ends up not making it into the JCO now. And it's just a question of, if you will, page count and volume as much as anything else. Let me say one other way. As an investigator, I got my share of rejection letters from the JCO. And unfortunately, sometimes I think the editors, were wrong. Something maybe should have been published there. But, we have to take our lumps and recognize that there's an earnest effort always there to just make sure that the most broadly interesting, highest quality, highest impact research gets published.
Well, I'm certainly one of those people who have gotten a JCO rejection, but it's all good because I think I speak for all of us at NRG Oncology in saying we appreciate the many ways in which ASCO advocates for us, especially through the National Cancer Institute and cancer patients in general. With all of the advocacy that ASCO does to make the voices of our cancer community heard, what are the ways that NRG can synergize and help with ASCO's efforts?
Well, I think this is the place where we just have to get involved. And as a little bit of background, ASCO, the professional society I've already described, was a tax-exempt org under the code 501c3, founded in 1964. But it's important, and people may not fully appreciate this, that several years ago, because of our drive to increase our policy and advocacy impact, and its particular advocacy impact, I should say, we established an ASCO that is the Association for Clinical Oncology, and it's a 501c6. And with that C6, we're able to have an associated or affiliated political action committee, and we in fact have the ASCO Association PAC. And we use these tools in order to help our members' voices get better represented on the Hill. anybody who's interested in that, you asked, what can NRG do? Certainly you can collaborate, and you can go to asco.org/get-involved/advocacy. That's a starting point, I think, for engagement. We have Hill Days that bring well over, I think now 150 advocates to the Hill. We meet one-on-one with legislators and regulators, and it is that one-to-one personal contact that really makes difference. If I may, I know I'm probably too long-winded already, but my own engagement with ASCO was born out of this kind of activity. And what I mean is, early in my career, and as you've heard, it's decades long, there was a long period of time when funding for the National Institute of Health, and by extension, the NCI, was held virtually flat for about a decade. And we used to call that a lost decade because with inflation at the time, that meant that there was a real loss of purchasing power. And I used to ask, why were we doing this? What was the intention in starving the NIH? And it turned out, in a bipartisan way, there was actually uniform support for faster, better progress against cancer. And that ushered in an era of increased year-over-year budgeting and helped us expand the progress that we've already been talking about in today's conversation. But the point I'm making is, I used to come here as part of ASCO's Government Relations Committee, and I used to come here when we went to the Hill as part of our Hill Days, and I would speak one-on-one with the legislative aides, sometimes with the senator or the representative. And while no one conversation would change things, the combination of ASCO and many like-minded organizations coming day after day to the Hill, telling related and similar stories about the importance of cancer research, ultimately led to that era of successful increases in funding. And so it's cynical to say you can't make a difference in Washington, but it's true you can't usually make a difference overnight. It takes a long-term commitment, patience, and the building of relationships. So all of that's to say, to answer your question, get involved.
I think that's a really great call to action, especially I think as physicians, we can relate to long-term commitment and patience and efforts, hopefully. Before we finish up today, I wanted to point out that you've been ASCO CEO, I believe, since 2016. So I think next year marks your 10th year in this role. What accomplishment have you been most proud of during your time as the CEO of ASCO? And what do the next 10 years look like for you?
The next 10 years, I will start with that. They almost certainly don't involve me still being at ASCO. I am a huge believer that organizations benefit from fresh perspectives and new talents and skills. And I think I was fortunate to be selected for this role in 2016. And I hope at least that I brought some of that here. And I think the organization will benefit from it again. In terms of what I'm most proud of, that's like asking, which of your children are your favorite, because in truth, I feel like we've had nearly a decade now of some remarkable growth and achievements. And so I can't pick just one thing. I would say there are a number of things that I'm very happy about. And I want to be careful because there's more to do in all these areas. But for one thing, I think we've made an important upgrade, as we just discussed, to ASCO's advocacy efforts. Number two, we have organized ASCO in a way that is, I think, responsible in terms of the management of the organization, the structure of it, the focus on consistent strategic planning, and the honing of our impact. That's something that I'm very, very proud of, aligning more and more of the staff and the volunteers around the places where we really do make a difference. And, that's a whole other conversation, but it really boils down to research, quality care, and education, the three pillars of our effort. I'm also very proud that we've made, I think, an important series of contributions to the evolving world of technology in healthcare. We didn't talk about that today, but of course we stood up an enterprise CancerLink, and we eventually spun that off. And in doing so, we helped shape some of the ways in which data is collected and utilized. And I'm talking here about real world evidence. And finally, I say that, I've been very, very happy with the increased reach of our educational efforts, by which I mean our meetings and the journals we discussed earlier, and the increasing globalization of our reach. It's important for, I think, everybody to realize that on the one hand, we're very focused, of course, on the United States, but on the other, a solid third or more of our members come from outside the US, and the problems and challenges of cancer on a global scale are really growing even more quickly than they are within the US. And our ability to contribute to a better world through collaborations globally, I think, is a huge opportunity. And we are certainly investing in that and building out capacity in that regard that I'm also very proud of. I'm sure when we finish this conversation, I'll think of 3 or 4 more things that I should have touted, but that's at least a start.
Well, Dr. Hudis, I'd like to thank you again for joining us on the NRG Oncology Podcast.
Thank you. It's really an honor, and it's also for me a lot of fun to talk about all this. This is the same conversation I'd have with you if we just met up for coffee in the morning.
Well, the pleasure is ours. Today, we had Dr. Clifford Hudis, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, joining us for a conversation on recent shifts in health policy, grants, and advocacy. The NRG Oncology Group is supported by grant funding from the National Institutes of Health, and content of this podcast does not necessarily reflect that of the National Cancer Institute. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and happy clinical trials.